Hello everybody and welcome to a very special list video today. Normally I do top fives and this week is going to be a little bit of a difference because the list just kept going and going and going. So instead of a top five, we'll be looking at the top 10 scenario designs. I've already done a list on my top five scenarios. They're the scenarios I always want to return to. But this is more of a twist because it's not really even the scenarios that I love to play the most. It's the ones where I look at them and I go, this is some really clever design. And so this will be a mix of scenarios that I love returning to, that I want to play over and over again, and some of them that might be a little bit more irritating to set up, which might be a barrier, or just a little irritating to work through. But I see what the designers are trying to do, and I can definitely enjoy that and respect that. And that's the entire reason why this list exists. So the list kept going and going, so I knew it was going to be I could do 10. But I think it's also good to do 10 because I have to wonder if some of it's going to come down to, I just like what they did here, and there might not be the same level of nuanced discussion about every single entry. Right up front, I'll say that I will not be outright spoiling the entire scenario, but I probably will be giving away strategic pointers that could ruin the scenario for you. But let's get into the list real quick. We'll start off with my number 10, which is Nebula, which I know is a contentious villain because she's very swingy. She's either a pushover or she is debatably harder than Ronan, which often tops the list of the most difficult scenario. What I like about her design is that she plays very similar. I mean, her hero pack was kind of used to mimic what the villain does, but she almost feels like a player. While the game itself gives you the ability to sort of play against this like machine that is going to, like, all the villain cards are designed, all the encounter cards are designed to just be mindless. They do something to you, and it feels like the villain you're playing against. And at the same time, like the rules are written in such a way that you pretty much know what you're supposed to do. And the cards are very clear. They work in a way where it's just like the highest cost this, the ally with the most health. If it's attacking you versus your friend at the table, like, the cards are written in such a way that this is going to affect you, and so all the stipulations are based on what is like within your part of the table. And that's still true with Nebula, but Nebula with her techniques feels like it's almost this sense that like she's going beyond just doing these things. She's like setting up these kind of like traps for you, and they all just kind of ping pong together to result in these turns that you can prepare for, but you can't always see coming. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that in her first stage, she gives the first technique that's revealed every turn, Surge. And then as you move up the list and you go to her stage 2 and 3, is it every? Yeah, it's the first technique revealed by each player. So as opposed to just the first one that's revealed in a round, it's the first one revealed by each player, gets Surge, and that can suddenly just trip up. So suddenly she goes to activate against you. There's the technique that's going off, but then like there's also other techniques that happen to be revealed, and suddenly they reveal another technique, and it just kind of cascades. And I understand how, from a new player perspective, even from a veteran player perspective, it can be very difficult. It can be very hard to gauge what's going to happen. But I do think that to some degree, I understand what they were going for, and even if they didn't get it all the way, I think that we're going to talk about another one later in this list that I think is an improvement over Nebula, but sort of hits on the same kind of beats. I respect, especially for like this box. Which one was this? This was Galaxy's Most Wanted. Was sort of, if I'm kind of looking at the timeline correctly, sort of designed in a bit of a bubble where, yes, they were probably leveling up the difficulty because the early player reaction was the game was too easy. But I also would wager that it was also sort of designed before the game came out. Not all of it, I don't think. I think that the kernels of the ideas, maybe the early designs, the first drafts of villains, might have been before the game even came out. So like they were sort of just shooting in the dark and maybe hadn't really even figured out exactly like what this game was until the mass population got it. Kind of the same way I look at the first wave of heroes. Like, they're all well and good, but I do think that you sort of see the designers get their stride as they move into waves 3 and 4. They really have a hold on like, okay, this is what people enjoy, so let's highlight these things. And I think that Nebula is an artifact of an older time, but I think it's a pretty clever design, and I think that the fact that it's not extremely predictable makes it a better design. Next up, we have my number 9, and I ended up landing on Risky Business, where you fight against Norman Osborn and Green Goblin. I decided that I wasn't going to show off the same villains twice. So if there's a villain that like repeats in some way, like the Collector or Apocalypse, what have you, like I was only going to represent a villain once. I really love Mutagen Formula. I think it is a great scenario to test a deck against. It gives you smaller minions, so you can kind of get that figured out. It throws a decent amount of large minions at you and a decent amount of side schemes at you. So you sort of get to test every part of your deck. The villain itself is maybe not the best, but that's kind of backed up by guard minions, etc. But I think that the Norman Osborn Green Goblin scenario, where they're flipping from basically an alter ego into a villain, is interesting. And it's interesting that we have not seen this really come about since. We've seen plenty of villains like double-sided, like the Collector, or Spiral. Like, we've seen villains where they're kind of invulnerable on one side, and then or what have you, like whatever that gimmick is. We've seen it multiple times, but this is really the only time where it's like the villain sort of, you get to decide when he's flipping back and forth. There is a way to set that up, but it really does feel like you're kind of fighting against an alter ego that's sort of like, why are you attacking Norman Osborn? He's just a respected businessman. And then on the other side, he's the Green Goblin, and you sort of have to gauge when's the appropriate time to flip him over, because every time he flips over, he does damage to you and whatnot. And just, especially because it's so early, it was like, I think this came out before the Rise of Red Skull box. So you had Rhino, Klaw, Ultron, and Green Goblin in terms of your environment. And I just think that in terms of a early design, even if it wasn't even if it didn't come out before the Red Skull, I think that just in terms of like what it was is so interesting, and I'd love to see more of it. I'd love to see like a Kingpin version of this. I think in terms of the Green Goblin, Norman Osborn villains that we've seen, including Venom Goblin, I think this is the most like interesting design, and maybe it wasn't perfect, but I really respect what they did. Next up, my number 8 is Thanos. And Thanos is this low on the list because I enjoy what he's doing. I love the idea of Thanos. I love the introduction of the gauntlet. I love the fact that if you let the side schemes go long enough, at some point he does snap his fingers and stuff happens. But I do think that he loses a little bit of score in my mind just because I think it can be tedious. It's a lot to keep track of. You got to do the stones, you got to do this, you got to do that. In multiplayer, it just turns into a really long game. And like, obviously, if you sit down to play against Thanos, you know what you're getting yourself into. And the reason why he is basically in the top, let's see, if there's like 50 villains now. So this is the top 20% of villains. The reason why he's up there in terms of design is because I do think the design is so on point. It is what we would have been asking for. Like if they made a Thanos that didn't have the Infinity Gauntlet, that wasn't themed around that, then a lot of people would be really disappointed. I like the fact that the Infinity Gauntlet is its own separate encounter set so that you can put it onto other villains. And actually, now that I think about it, I should do that more often. I should just put the Infinity Gauntlet onto Batroc and see how it goes. But either way, I just love what Thanos represents. I love the fight against him. I love that it's not easy. You can't necessarily call that you've beat the game 6 turns in. There are some villains where okay, I've got all the momentum. There's nothing that's going to stop me here. Like, I'm just going to win. And that's not necessarily how Thanos works. More skilled players than me probably can be like, we build up, then we wipe out his first stage, and then by the time he flips over, or I guess his first or second stage, depending on what difficulty you're playing at. But we go through the first stage that we're fighting against, and with that second stage, we just nuke him immediately. We deal 45 damage in one turn, what have you. And varying levels of difficulty. But in terms of design, I just think that his cards are so thematic. This is exactly what people who were entrenched in the MCU would have wanted Thanos to be, and I just love what we've got here. Next up, we have the Juggernaut, my number 7. And this one, I think on a different day would make my top 5. But as I stopped to think about it, I went, the thing that's holding the Juggernaut back is just that I feel like the design is interesting. The design makes sense. He's got his momentum counters. He can deal more damage. You have to flip the helmet over. But I do think that the one part of it that sort of is guardrails for new players, but sort of falls flat when you're an established player, is that you have to include Hope, and Hope has the mental resource on her, so she's dealing additional damage when you flip over the helmet. The Juggernaut takes additional damage from cards with mental resources on them, which I should do a deep dive to figure out how many attacks have a mental resource on them. That's probably a simple search, but either way, I enjoyed the Juggernaut the first time I played him. I've enjoyed him pretty much every time I've played him, but there is that kind of tinge of, this one seems easier to solve even than like Norman Osborn. I would say the Norman Osborn risky business scenario, like there is a way to very much just sort of like camp out and then switch into Green Goblin and nuke him, and that kind of takes a little bit of the fun out. But I think Juggernaut is kind of the same thing. There are cards that flip over his helmet again, and you do want to incentivize getting his helmet over. So you almost have to look at your opening hand going, okay, I need 3 of the same resource so I can flip this helmet over. And that does take away from it a little bit. It's hard because I don't want to just discount scenarios that are too easy, because I think that that's like not fair, because not every scenario should be extremely difficult. And I like scenarios that are just breezy, but there's just a part of me that goes, the Juggernaut, there's just something in my soul that says that this could be just a little bit better, and that's why it falls down on the list. That said, the introduction of, or the inclusion of Black Tom Cassidy, the inclusion of Hope Summers just as a character, I wish it was recommended. Like they just put 2 recommended things in, because I think right now it's Juggernaut, Standard, and Hope, and then recommended was Black Tom Cassidy. I wish it was Juggernaut, Standard, maybe some other small encounter set, although I guess Hope only puts 1 card in. Either way, but the recommended was Black Tom Cassidy and Hope, just so that like from outside, and I know that the designers know this, but just outside of the campaign kind of setting, when you're just playing it one shot, and that's mainly the way that I play Marvel Champions, that every game didn't need Hope in it. I understand what they're going for, and when you're first playing through the Next Evolution box, the inclusion of Hope doesn't seem that intrusive. But the more you play with it, the deeper you get in, the more times you play it, you're just like, yeah, does this break if I just take Hope out of it? Because it is sort of a crutch, and that's unfortunate. In some scenarios that's great, in some scenarios it's not. And yeah, just overall, love the design, but it just has enough caveats that just kind of keeps it out of my top 5. Next up, we've got my number 6, which is Mojo. Now, truth be told, I've only played Mojo maybe 3 times, but I was so impressed by this. The idea of like moving threat around, putting threat onto heroes, doing this, doing that. What was his deal again? It was a force response of, after your turn ends, discard the top 3 cards in the encounter deck, place 1 threat on your hero for each card discarded this way that does not belong to the Mojo encounter sets. So yeah, he plays very similar to the Hood. He plays with multiple encounter sets, and he cares about you using his encounter sets versus other ones, and as a signifier. And I believe it's his main scheme, like when you flip over to Alter Ego, all your threat falls off onto the sides, or the main scheme. Something like that. I could be getting it wrong. This is all coming off the top of my head. Either way, just playing around with that, having this like 20 threat per player goal. And while the gimmick of the different genres gets a little bit old for me, it's nothing that really takes me out of the game, but just more like I can live without this. but I understand why it's there. It's thematic and everything. But overall, like, just the general design of Mojo, I think is just so much fun, and it's a different way of playing, and you have to like stop and really think about like, what am I doing here? Because you can't play it like the Rhino. You can't play it like Ultron. You need to, like every other one, like each one of these scenarios is its own kind of like mini game using the engine of Marvel Champions, and Mojo is just one of those ones that stands out to me. Next up, we have my number 5, which is really what kicked off this list and made me go, okay, I need to do this, because I am so impressed by the Black Widow encounter set from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And I will be very careful with any kind of spoilers here, just because this is brand new. A lot of it just sits right on the villain card, which we've known for months. And her basic gimmick is that when you attack her, you remove a threat from the main scheme, and then you discard the top card of the encounter deck, and if it has a preparation ability on it, then you resolve that. And it's very similar to Nebula, where there's this back and forth, and I love the idea that you can sit there and go, okay, I'm going to get all the threat out of the main scheme, so that this ability, you just get like a free turn, and then you need to have someone basically take the responsibility to get the main scheme back down during the next player phase, and you just sit there and you can very much cheese it that way. But when you try to do that, sometimes the game gets out of control, and suddenly you're like, oh, I've got 16 threat with 2 players, and we need to get this figured out because this is getting bad. Maybe 16 is too high. I think she's 10 per player. I don't remember. No, I guess that would still work. Maybe she's 7 per player. Threat levels besides, she can get out of hand, but I do just really, I love what they're doing here. And maybe a year from now, this wouldn't make a top 10 list, but just in the Cult of New status, I just love what they did with her, and I'm so happy that she's in the game, and she's a really fun opening scenario. She might be more complex than I would like for an opening scenario of a box. I think if you've made your way through Rhino, Klaw, and Ultron, and maybe you've only made your way through Rhino and said, okay, I need to move on to something else as a new player, she might be a little bit fair. Like, I don't want this to be your first game of Marvel Champions, but I think that she's easy enough to follow. She doesn't feel unfair. I think a lot of it sits on the table, and you understand what you're getting yourself into. There are cards that add preparation to cards that do not have preparations on them, so that you are constantly triggering her ability, and generally that kind of trigger means that you will be getting rid of the card that grants preparation to things. But overall, love this scenario, love what they're doing here, and it impressed me the times that I played it. Next up, we have my number 4, which is Mr. Sinister out of the Next Evolution box. And I will say right up front that I'm probably an unusual person, because I think the Next Evolution box is one of the best boxes that you can get. I love so many of the scenarios, not only for design, but also in terms of just what they're doing. I would say the one that falls flat the most for me is maybe Strife, the final scenario in the box. But overall, the other ones I just think are totally incredible, and I love playing them, and it's my favorite box. I know that's probably a little outside of the norm. I think a lot of people don't feel the same way as I do. But Mr. Sinister, if nothing else, I think can be agreed upon as one of the high points of the box, even if it's not your favorite box. And he adds in these small modular encounter sets that give him flight, super strength, and telepathy, and you will see 2 of those over the course of the scenario. They all look up the main schemes that give you them, or maybe they're side schemes, I don't remember now, but the schemes that basically grant these abilities to Mr. Sinister, you're only going to see 2 of the 3. You randomly throw one of them out and you just don't play with it for the game. So that does add some replayability. But in terms of just even what those modular counter starters do, it's like the Infinity Gauntlet. It adds another thing that you can add to other scenarios that definitively shake up what that hero is going to do. You know, Juggernaut with telepathy, the Rhino with flight, or Collector with super strength. And I think just in terms of like the way that Mr. Sinister is designed, where you don't want to put status counters on him, and he is just kind of doing his own thing. I think just overall, he's a very baseline villain that just has all these little pieces that add on top of him that just take him from being Rhino and twist him into Rhino, but cooler. with like all these attachments and stuff, and just in general, yeah, I really enjoy sitting down and playing him. I enjoy the replayability, and I enjoy what the designers did here, because I do think that it is something that I think even just the fact that you have to try to avoid putting status counters on him, which includes even tough. So like looking at the Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. box, where you've got the Pericles that can add status counters to the villain, that changes a lot when you get to Mr. Sinister, because all of a sudden Mr. Sinister is placing threat on the main scheme because you decided that you wanted to confuse him. And suddenly Maria Hill's little like status lock is not as effective. In fact, it might be worse. And so yeah, just those tiny little twists I think are just great. And I think that in terms of just like the design they set up is incredible, and I really enjoy it. Next up, we have our number 3. Or we have my number 3, which is Klaw. And I think Klaw is indicative of the fact that even from the core set, I think they had a great design. And there's not a lot to Klaw, really. Just his gimmick of when he attacks, he gets an additional encounter card or an additional boost card is interesting, because it kind of tells you that not every scenario from the core set tells you that not every scenario is going to be the same. And it really changes your ability to kind of threat assess. Like, is Klaw going to attack me and I'm going to take 1 or 0? Maybe I'm going to take 5. You don't know. The inclusion of the Masters of Evil, giving you these big, bulky minions to go through, which those are recommended, so you can always switch them out, put in something else. But in terms of just what's going on here, the simplicity of design, and this is, I mean, I think it's probably obvious, but I think this is the best encounter in the core set. You know, Rhino has his difficulties. He has his flaws where it's like, okay, I wish that threat was bumped up a little bit. And Ultron is one of those villains that it's either really easy for your hero or in an easy scenario for your hero to get overwhelmed in. But Klaw just feels like that nice, sweet spot where he's hard. He's not easy the first time you play him, but he's not impossible. But he's also not one where you feel like you can just cheese it. There probably are ways to cheese all these scenarios and just make them super simple. But Klaw feels like the one that is a very baseline, simple to understand scenario. You go through multiple main schemes, so you have time to sort of like go back and forth with him. And each one of his stages feels, you know, compelling. And it just overall, I enjoy sitting down and playing Klaw. He's just one of those scenarios that I will throw a deck against just to see like, okay, how does this handle things? Can I easily, like, is my perfect defense deck really that good? Because Klaw might hit me for 5. I suppose Juggernaut could also hit you for 5. But yeah, I enjoy what's going on here. And I just find it so fun. And I enjoy that it's part of the core set so that everybody can have it. Everybody can play against it and have that, you know, communal understanding of what the game is. Next up, we have my number 2, which I really feel like is controversial. I feel like there's a lot of people that don't think about this scenario very much, and I think about the scenario a lot. I love Kang the Conqueror. I love the once and future Kang scenario, and this is really inclusive to multiplayer, which it's interesting. I feel like they kind of got away from multiplayer kind of stuff. Like Arkham has a lot of massive multiplayer stuff, and this isn't massive multiplayer, but like this, it pushes you more toward multiplayer, and it's kind of the only scenario like that. When you move into the second stage of Kang in a multiplayer game, you split into different games. And I think that's just so interesting. And I think that it's so much fun. And that means that in single player, you have one of 4 villains you could go up against before you go to stage 3. You have to make it to stage 3. This changes the way that you evaluate certain cards, because all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, this card does X, where X is equal to the stage number. So now not only are you playing through 3 stages, so you're going to have more chances to play it, but you're also going to always get to see this card does 1, this card does 2, this card does 3, and overall, like, that's kind of a in the weeds kind of thing. But just overall, I love the design of Kang. I love that he has this obligation focus. I love that he brings in your nemesis without necessarily needing to bring in Shadows of the Past. And yeah, just overall, I really enjoy Kang, and I think he's a great design. I think he's difficult, and there's no question about that. I think that there's probably there's probably ways to cheese this, but to me, this is definitely one where I'm just like, oh yeah, no, this is sometimes can be difficult, depending on how it happens. you move into stage 2 and you might as well just thread out. You need to prioritize living to stage 3 over defeating stage 2. And sometimes you just get into it and all of a sudden you're just like, okay, I'm at 8 of 9 threat, and that was just the villain's first turn. There are definitely maybe some weak spots, but overall, I love what this scenario does, and I can't speak more highly of it. I think it's one of the best scenarios in the game. And finally, we have my number 1, which is, what's that? Which one is that? It is the Morlock Siege. I suppose it's the Marauders, so you could probably also include On the Run. But I think I like Morlock Siege because you actually get to fight through multiple Marauders. And you get to have the Morlocks with the tough stash tokens, and there's the Nox thing, like the 3 Nox or whatever. Like, just overall, in general, I love what they did here. I love that they were able to take a villain collection and turn it into 2 scenarios that are separate, but they feel distinct. But yeah, just Morlock Siege. I love the idea that you need to keep the threat down so that the knock counters are what kicks you into the next main scheme. I love the idea of fighting through multiple villains. I think this is my favorite multi-villain scenario. I generally find multi-villain scenarios to be interesting, but sort of a lot to understand. And this is streamlined in a way where it's like I don't feel like my head's going to explode trying to understand it. Kind of like the 4 Horsemen are very difficult. And I guess the other thing is that I haven't played against the Thunderbolts yet, so I don't necessarily know how that plays. But overall, I just love what happens here. I love getting the Morlock allies, trying to keep them safe. This one always feels like it's the appropriate amount of difficulty. It's the appropriate amount of time. I never feel like I'm playing this scenario too long. I feel like definitely there are times when you had to slow down the game, but for the most part it feels very breezy. And I just appreciate, once again, the cleverness of being able to take villains and turn them into multiple scenarios. Like, that's not something that we get to do all the time. I don't think there's another scenario like that. Thunderbolts is definitely one of those ones where it's not the same, but you're basically saying, we're going to give you Thunderbolts in the back of hero packs so that I think it's 5 or 6 that you have now can definitely be swapped out and you can have a very different experience. I would have loved for that to have been how the next evolution hero packs works, although I guess in that case then you're putting villain cards into the back of packs, which then if you don't have the box is kind of meaningless. But either way, I love the design of this. It may not be my favorite scenario to ever play against, but that's not what this list is. But I do think that just Morlock Siege in general is just such a cool design. It feels fresh and new, and the tension is there, like, okay, which 3 are we going to see? Did we do it? Okay, we did it. And then, yeah, just overall, kudos, love it, and that is great. But what is your favorite, like, I guess essentially mini game? Like, what scenario is designed in a way that you think is clever, that you think is great, that you love playing against? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, thank you very much and have a great day.